The night they kicked me out of my own $100 million mansion, it was raining. Hard. The kind of rain that drowns out even the loudest sobs. I stood there, on the marble steps of the house I built from nothing, with the taste of betrayal thick in my mouth and the echo of my daughter's words still stinging in my ears. "You've had your time, Dad. It's our turn now." My turn. As if decades of sacrifice, blood, and sleepless nights could be erased like numbers on a ledger. As if a man's legacy could be signed away with a pen and a smile. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just turned, stepped into the rain, and let the heavy gates close behind me. My name is Charles Bennett. 72 years old. Founder of Bennett Global Holdings, an empire worth just over $100 million. Or at least, it was. Until my own flesh and blood decided they wanted it for themselves. It all began when I started to get sick. Nothing terminal, just age catching up. My wife had been gone 5 years by then, and my children, Sarah and Lucas, became more attentive than usual. Dinners every week. Calls every day. Smiles that felt rehearsed. I knew they wanted control of the company, and eventually, the estate. I didn't blame them for wanting to help, but their tone changed the moment I mentioned creating a charitable trust. Suddenly, they weren't concerned, they were furious. "Why give it away, Dad?" Lucas said. "It's family money. Our money." Sarah added, "You've done enough. You should just rest. Let us handle things." I should have seen it coming. The lawyers. The power of attorney papers. The small print buried in contracts they said were for my protection. Within 6 months, my assets were transferred into a joint trust, one they could control, for my safety. By the time I realized what they'd done, I had nothing. My company, my accounts, even the deed to my own home, all gone. And then, on that cold November night, they told me to leave. I walked away without a word. Because I knew something they didn't. I still owned the most important thing they could never take, the knowledge of how I'd built every brick of their world. And that meant I could build it again, or burn theirs down, legally. I started small. My old lawyer, Benjamin Hart, had been with me for 30 years. Loyal, sharp, and discreet. He was shocked when I told him what happened. "They got greedy," I said. "Now it's time they learn what that costs." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You want to fight them in court?" I smiled. "No. I want them to fight themselves." We began quietly. I requested records of the family trust, the corporate filings, the transfers they'd made. It turned out, in their haste, my children had cut a few corners, forging my consent on certain documents. Benjamin's team found proof within a week. Then we traced the company transactions. Lucas had siphoned funds into a personal account in the Cayman Islands. Sarah had borrowed millions against company credit lines to fund her husband's real estate projects. Fraud. Embezzlement. Perjury. All under my name. They thought they'd taken control, but what they'd done was hang themselves with my rope. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I had something better in mind. I reached out to an old friend, Michael Green, the CEO of a major investment group I'd once helped save from bankruptcy. He owed me a favor. Within 2 months, I had quietly acquired controlling shares of Bennett Global through subsidiaries. Shares my children didn't even know existed. When the next board meeting came, they strutted in like royalty. I walked in behind them. The look on their faces when I took my old seat at the head of the table, priceless. Lucas sputtered, "You can't be here. You don't even own," Michael cut him off. "Actually, Mr. Bennett is once again the majority shareholder. As of this morning." Sarah's face drained of color. "What did you do?" I looked at her calmly. "I built this company once. You think I couldn't build it again? I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply slid a folder across the table, evidence of every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature. Their signatures. This, I said softly, is the difference between ambition and greed. You took what wasn't yours. You betrayed your father, your family, and yourselves. They sat in silence. Lucas tried to speak, but no sound came out. Sarah began to cry. I won't press charges, I continued. Not if you walk away. Today. The house, the company, everything, gone. You start over, the same way I did. They knew better than to argue. Within hours, the papers were signed. I drove back to my mansion the next morning. The same gates that had closed behind me now swung open. The air smelled like rain again, but this time it felt clean. The house was empty. Quiet. But it was mine. I walked through the halls slowly, my hand brushing against the walls, memories echoing in every corner. My wife's laughter, my children's footsteps, the years I'd built everything with love, and the moment they'd torn it down for greed. As I reached the balcony, the city stretched below me, bright, alive, endless. I had taken back everything they stole. Not with rage. Not with revenge. With precision. Legally. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about destruction. It's about restoration. And that night, as I poured myself a glass of whiskey and looked out over the lights of the city I'd built, I finally understood something. I hadn't just won back my fortune. I'd won back my peace. They took my home. I let them. Then I took back everything, piece by piece, law by law, until all that remained was the truth. And the truth was simple. Greed builds empires that crumble. Patience builds legacies that last. Weeks passed, and the mansion began to feel alive again, not with noise or guests, but with purpose. I'd spent so many years chasing growth that I'd forgotten what silence could teach. Every morning, I'd walk through the gardens my wife once tended, the ones my children ignored after she died. Roses had overgrown the path, ivy had crawled over the fountain, but beneath the neglect there was still beauty, just waiting to be cared for again. That was how I felt, too. For a while, I didn't hear from Sarah or Lucas. I expected anger, lawsuits, drama. Instead, there was only silence, the kind that comes after a storm has torn through and left nothing but the wreckage behind. But one evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, my phone rang. The name made my chest tighten, Sarah. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Her voice was small, hesitant. Dad, can we talk? I said nothing at first. She took my silence as permission. I lost everything, she whispered. The house, the cars, the accounts, it's all gone. Lucas disappeared. I don't even know where he is. I closed my eyes. I had known this would happen. When greed drives you, you spend faster than you can think. Dad, I'm sorry, she continued, her voice breaking. I didn't understand what I was doing. I just wanted to keep what Mom helped you build. The mention of her mother hit me hard. My wife had always been the glue between us. She believed in kindness, even when it wasn't deserved. And though a part of me wanted to hang up, to let Sarah face the same coldness she had shown me, another part, the part my wife had loved, wouldn't allow it. Come home, I said finally. Just you. When she arrived, she looked nothing like the confident, polished woman who'd once sat in my boardroom. Her hair was tied back, her makeup gone, her eyes tired and swollen. She hesitated at the door like a stranger unsure if she was welcome. I didn't say a word. I just stepped aside. She walked in slowly, her gaze sweeping across the marble floors, the chandeliers, the portraits. Everything was the same, and yet, everything had changed. I forgot how beautiful this place was, she murmured. No, I said quietly. You forgot why it was beautiful. She nodded, tears spilling over. I was wrong, Dad. About everything. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We sat in silence, the kind that mends what words can't. Over the next few weeks, Sarah stayed in one of the guest rooms. She helped clean the gardens, cooked small meals, and for the first time in years, we talked, really talked. About her mother, about mistakes, about forgiveness. As for Lucas, he didn't come back. Not yet. But I knew he would, eventually. They always do, when the money runs out and the truth catches up. Months later, I quietly transferred ownership of one of my smaller properties to Sarah, not as a reward, but as a chance. You lost your way, I told her. Now find your purpose. She hugged me, trembling. Thank you, Dad. I don't deserve this. Maybe not, I said, but you can earn it now. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, I looked at the framed photo of my wife on the mantel, her gentle smile frozen in time. You'd be proud, I whispered. Because I'd realized something even more powerful than revenge. Taking back what was mine had given me justice. But giving grace, that gave me peace. And peace is what my children needed, even more than punishment. I built an empire once out of ambition. But the legacy I wanted to leave behind wasn't wealth or property. It was wisdom. That no matter how dark betrayal gets, light still finds a way in, if you let it. So, when I finally closed my eyes that night, the mansion didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like home again, not because I'd reclaimed it, but because forgiveness had finally stepped through the front door. I took back my fortune. I took back my name. But most importantly, I took back my family. And in the quiet hum of that house, I could almost hear my wife's voice again, calm, certain, and proud. You did the right thing, Charles. You didn't just win. You healed. A few more months passed, and peace began to feel natural again. I had stopped checking the company reports every morning. The mansion no longer echoed with ghosts of regret but with quiet signs of life, the clink of a coffee cup, the creak of the old oak door, the gentle hum of Sarah's voice as she worked in the garden. One morning, as I was reading on the veranda, a car pulled into the driveway. It was black, dusty, and unmistakably expensive. I didn't need to see who stepped out, I already knew. Lucas. He looked older. Not in years, but in burden. His once perfect suit hung loosely on him, and the arrogance that used to fill every inch of his posture had evaporated. He stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me like a boy who'd been lost far too long. Dad, he said, his voice rough. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't answer right away. My eyes studied him, not the son who betrayed me, but the broken man standing in front of me. He was shaking slightly, not from cold, but from shame. I made a mess of everything, he went on. The businesses I invested in collapsed. The accounts are gone. Sarah told me what happened here. She said you forgave her. I set my book down and stood slowly. Forgiveness isn't something I hand out like a loan, Lucas. It's something you have to be ready to earn. He nodded, eyes glistening. Then, tell me how. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I turned toward the old garden. Your mother planted those roses when you were 6. They're dying now. You want to earn forgiveness? Start there. He hesitated, glancing at his tailored shoes, clearly not meant for dirt. Then he knelt, and began to work. Day after day, I watched him. No complaints, no shortcuts. Just quiet labor. His hands, once used to typing on glass and signing contracts, were now blistered and raw from pruning and soil. Sarah joined him sometimes. I'd see them talking softly, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing. Slowly, the space between them, between us, began to close. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But it was real. One afternoon, months later, the roses bloomed again, full, fragrant, alive. Lucas stood there, staring at them like he'd just seen a miracle. "They look like they used to," he said. "No," I replied. "They look better. Because they survived." He turned to me, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Dad. For everything. I thought I was proving myself. I didn't see what I was destroying." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You lost everything money could buy, Lucas. But you've started to earn back what it couldn't: integrity." He nodded, tears welling up, and for the first time in years, he embraced me. That night, as the three of us sat around the dinner table, something we hadn't done in over a decade, I looked at my children. They weren't perfect. Neither was I. But there was something stronger now between us than wealth, or legacy, or pride. There was understanding. Later, when they both had gone to bed, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The city lights shimmered below, just as they had the night I reclaimed my home. But this time, I didn't feel victorious. I felt whole. I realized then that revenge had only ever been the first step. It restored balance, yes, but forgiveness restored meaning. I thought about the mansion, the company, the money, all of it built from ambition and rebuilt from pain. But in the end, the only thing worth keeping was peace. As I looked out into the night, the wind carried a faint scent of roses. My wife's garden, blooming again after years of neglect, just like us. I smiled and whispered softly to the darkness, as if she could still hear me, "It's done, love. We're whole again." And in that quiet, I finally understood, true revenge isn't about taking back what was stolen. It's about rebuilding what was lost. Because money fades, empires crumble, and names are forgotten. But forgiveness, real, hard-earned forgiveness, endures. And that's the legacy I wanted to leave behind. Time, as it always does, moved on, soft and slow at first, then all at once. The house that once felt like a monument to pride became a home again. I stopped counting the years since my wife's passing, because now, life was beginning to move forward instead of standing still in her absence. Lucas began helping with the company again, not as an heir, but as an employee, one of many. I made sure of that. No titles, no boardrooms, no special treatment. He started from the bottom, and to his credit, he didn't complain once. He earned respect the hard way, the only way that matters. Sarah, meanwhile, started a charity foundation in her mother's name, focused on supporting single parents who'd lost their partners. The same kind of strength her mother had once carried quietly every day. Watching them both rebuild their lives taught me something I wish I'd known years ago: sometimes, people have to lose everything to truly see what matters. There were still moments when the old hurt flickered, memories of betrayal, echoes of arguments that cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. But whenever bitterness tried to return, I'd look at my children and remind myself of the truth: they weren't the same people who'd thrown me out that night. They'd fallen. But they'd also learned to stand again, and that was all I had ever wanted for them. One evening, as I sat in my study going through old papers, Sarah came in holding an envelope. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled. "Something we've been working on." Inside was a deed, not for property, but for the Bennett Foundation for Ethical Business Practices. A nonprofit dedicated to mentoring young entrepreneurs about integrity, leadership, and family values in business. The idea was simple: to teach others not to repeat the mistakes we did. "You're the founder, Dad," Lucas said, stepping in behind her. "In honor of the lessons you taught us." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My hands trembled as I held the papers, realizing this: not the mansion, not the company, not the wealth, was what would carry my name into the future. I nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure this lasts longer than any fortune ever could." We launched the foundation quietly. No press, no fanfare. Just purpose. And to my surprise, it grew faster than any of us imagined. People respected the story behind it, the fall, the redemption, the message that it's never too late to rebuild with integrity. Months later, on the foundation's first anniversary, we hosted a small gathering in the mansion's ballroom. The same hall where years ago, my children had turned against me. But this time, laughter filled the air, not anger. Hope, not greed. Sarah gave a speech. Lucas followed. Then they both turned to me. "Say something, Dad," Sarah urged. I walked to the podium, my cane tapping softly against the marble floor. The crowd fell silent. I looked out at them, business leaders, students, families, and then at my children. "I once believed success was measured by what you owned," I began. "Then I lost everything, my fortune, my home, even my family. I thought that was the end. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. Because losing everything showed me what truly matters, who stands beside you when you have nothing." I paused, looking toward Sarah and Lucas. These two, they made mistakes. Big ones. But they also made the choice to change. And that choice, that courage, is worth more than every dollar I ever earned. There were tears in Sarah's eyes, and Lucas was gripping the edge of the table to keep his composure. "So tonight," I continued, "I don't celebrate wealth, or victory, or revenge. I celebrate redemption. Because forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. And that is what builds a legacy worth leaving." Applause filled the room, but all I could hear was my wife's voice again, soft and proud, echoing somewhere deep in my memory. "You did it, Charles. You didn't just build a company. You built a family again." Later that night, after everyone left, I walked alone through the quiet halls. The chandeliers glowed softly above, the same ones that had witnessed betrayal, anger, and reconciliation. I stopped at the portrait of my wife in the foyer, the same one I'd stood before so many times. "Rest easy," I whispered. "They're finally home." Outside, the garden was in full bloom again. The roses, bright and fragrant, swayed gently in the night breeze. The same roses that had survived storms, neglect, and time, yet still stood tall, just as we did. And as I watched them, I realized something simple but profound: revenge might start the story, but forgiveness finishes it. Because in the end, the sweetest victory isn't reclaiming what was taken. It's finding peace in what remains. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The years that followed passed quietly, marked not by headlines or corporate takeovers, but by laughter echoing through the halls of my home. The kind of laughter that had been absent for too long. The mansion that once symbolized power now felt like what it was always meant to be, a place of warmth, a sanctuary built not on wealth, but on reconciliation. The Bennett Foundation flourished beyond our expectations. What began as a modest project became a national initiative. Schools and universities began adopting our ethics program, and countless young entrepreneurs reached out, sharing how our story had changed how they viewed success. They called me Mr. Bennett, but to me, that name didn't mean the CEO anymore. It meant the man who had finally learned to listen, to forgive, to live. Lucas worked tirelessly behind the scenes, avoiding recognition but earning it all the same. He mentored others the way I once mentored him, with firm honesty and quiet compassion. Sarah became the public face of the foundation, speaking on panels, writing articles, sharing our journey. Every time I watched her stand on stage, voice steady and confident, I felt a swell of pride, not in her achievements, but in her strength. There were still moments when the past tugged at me. I would wake in the middle of the night sometimes, remembering the rain, the gate closing behind me, the sting of betrayal. But when those memories came, I would look around my room, the same room that had once felt empty, and remind myself how far we had come. It's strange how the heart heals, not suddenly, but gradually, quietly, until one day, you realize the ache has turned into gratitude. I remember one afternoon, maybe 5 years after everything, Lucas came into my study with a small box. He placed it on the desk in front of me. "What's this?" I asked. "Something I found while going through Mom's things," he said. Inside was an old, faded letter, written in my wife's neat cursive. I hadn't seen it in years. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The date at the top was only a few months before she passed away. "Charles," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. But promise me something, don't let the business take our family away from you. Money can build walls just as easily as it builds homes. If the walls ever rise too high, tear them down before they keep you from seeing what matters most." My throat tightened. She had seen it all before it happened. She'd always been the quiet prophet of our lives, seeing where pride would lead us long before we did. I looked up at Lucas, who was standing silently, watching me. "She knew," I whispered. He nodded. "She always did." That night, we gathered in the garden, Sarah, Lucas, and I, beneath the oak tree that had watched over our lives for decades. We buried the letter there, beneath the roots, beside the roses that had once symbolized our brokenness and now stood as proof of our survival. I said a few words, not as a father seeking forgiveness, not as a man reclaiming his empire, but as someone finally at peace. "Mom built this family," I said softly. "I nearly destroyed it. But somehow, love found its way back. Let's make sure it never gets lost again." We stood in silence for a long while, the night air cool and calm. A breeze rustled through the branches above us, and for a fleeting second, I could have sworn I felt her presence there, gentle, proud, and at peace. Years later, when my time finally began to slow, I wrote my will. It was simple. The mansion would go to the foundation, to be turned into a retreat for young entrepreneurs, a place to learn not just about business, but about balance, humility, and integrity. My children would each inherit enough to live comfortably, but the rest would go toward building futures, not fortunes. I didn't tell them right away. Some lessons are best discovered after you're gone. On my final evening, as I sat by the window, the city lights flickering in the distance, I felt no bitterness, no anger, no fear. Only peace. I had lived long enough to see revenge turn into forgiveness, and forgiveness turn into legacy. The clock ticked softly in the background. The roses outside swayed under the silver light of the moon. I took one last breath and smiled, not because I had won, but because I had learned. And when my children found me the next morning, sitting quietly in my chair, they said I looked content. On the table beside me was a single note, written in my hand: "Don't chase revenge. Build peace. It lasts longer." And beneath it, in smaller writing, a truth that had carried me through it all: greed fades. Love remains. Peace endures. Always. The days after my passing were filled with a silence that stretched through every corner of the house. But it wasn't the cold, empty kind of silence that had once followed betrayal. It was softer now, like the pause after a song has ended, and you're left still feeling the music. Sarah and Lucas handled the arrangements together. No fighting. No arguing. They moved through the halls with quiet reverence, speaking softly, touching the walls, the portraits, the memories. The mansion, our home, had witnessed rage, greed, and redemption. Now it would bear witness to legacy. They found my letter, of course. I'd left it in my study, tucked inside the top drawer of my old oak desk, the same one where I'd once signed away everything, and later signed it all back. It read, "If you're reading this, then my story has ended. But yours is just beginning. Don't repeat my mistakes. Don't build walls of pride or chase ghosts of wealth. Build bridges instead. Between each other. Between what you dream and what's right. I've given you both everything I could, not money, but meaning. Keep it alive. When Sarah read it aloud, she couldn't finish the last line. Her voice broke, and Lucas put a hand on her shoulder. For the first time in years, they cried, not out of guilt or anger, but out of love. The funeral was simple, just as I'd asked. No marble statues, no corporate tributes, no shallow speeches about success. Just family, a few old friends, and the sound of wind moving through the oak branches above my resting place, the same tree where we buried my wife's letter all those years ago. When the service ended, Sarah placed a single rose on my casket, one from the garden I'd once asked Lucas to tend. It was in full bloom, crimson and perfect. She whispered, "We'll take care of everything, Dad. You can rest now." And they did. Months later, the mansion reopened, not as a private estate, but as the Bennett Center for Integrity and Leadership. The Great Hall became a library. The ballroom became a lecture space. The garden, my wife's garden, became a sanctuary for reflection, a quiet place for anyone seeking clarity. Visitors came from around the world, young business leaders, students, dreamers, and even those who'd lost their way. They came not to learn how to make millions, but how to make meaning. And though I wasn't there to see it, I like to think my presence lingered, in the creak of the old floorboards, in the hum of the chandeliers, in the whisper of the trees outside. Lucas often walked the grounds after hours, stopping by the oak tree where his mother and I rested. He'd talk to us, about the foundation's progress, about the people they helped, about how proud he was of Sarah. Sometimes he'd laugh softly and say, "You were right, Dad. It wasn't the money that mattered. It never was." Sarah, on the other hand, took to sitting by the window in my old study, reading the letters people sent to the foundation, stories of redemption, of families rebuilt, of forgiveness found. She kept them all in a box labeled Legacies. Every year, on the anniversary of my passing, they hosted an event called the Bennett Evening of Reflection. No sponsors, no profits, just people gathering to share stories about lessons learned the hard way, and how forgiveness had changed their lives. And each year, they ended it the same way, with Sarah reading a quote carved into the marble plaque at the mansion's entrance: "Greed builds empires that crumble. Forgiveness builds legacies that last." Years later, when Sarah and Lucas grew older, they passed the foundation on to the next generation, not blood, but belief. People who understood what the Bennett name had come to mean, not wealth, but wisdom. The mansion still stands today, its lights glowing softly at night. The oak tree has grown wider, stronger, its roots deep in the same soil where our family once fell apart, and then found each other again. And when the wind moves through its branches, some say you can almost hear a whisper, faint but steady, carrying through the leaves like a promise kept through time: "You did it right, Charles. You turned pain into peace." And so, the story of the man who lost everything, and gained far more, lives on. Not in gold. Not in property. Not in power. But in the unshakable truth that outlasts all of it: revenge may start the story, but forgiveness is what makes it worth remembering. Years turned to decades, and the Bennett name became something far greater than the symbol of a once-lost empire. It became a lesson, whispered in lecture halls, quoted in essays, and carried by those who had walked through the doors of the mansion-turned-foundation. The oak tree outside had grown enormous, its roots deep and powerful, its branches stretching wide enough to shelter hundreds who came to sit beneath it. Students, CEOs, even broken families, all came seeking something they couldn't quite name: peace. They called it the Bennett tree, and they said it had an energy to it, a calmness that quieted even the loudest thoughts. Over time, stories about the mansion spread far beyond the city. People said that those who came there burdened with guilt often left lighter, as if the place itself carried a heartbeat of forgiveness. And maybe, in a way, it did. One evening, long after both Sarah and Lucas had passed, a young man stood beneath that very oak tree. His name was Daniel, a distant relative, a generation removed. He had inherited none of the wealth, but all of the curiosity. He was 24, ambitious, and, like I once was, consumed by the idea of success. He'd read about me, Charles Bennett, the man who had built an empire, lost it to his own children, and somehow found peace instead of vengeance. He had come to see if the stories were true. Daniel stood in silence for a long time, his hand resting against the rough bark of the oak. The setting sun painted the mansion gold, and the air was filled with the faint scent of roses, still blooming after all these years. He sat beneath the tree and opened his notebook. In it, he had written a single question: what makes peace stronger than power? He didn't expect an answer, but as the wind rustled through the leaves, a single rose petal drifted down, landing softly on the page. He stared at it, then smiled, the kind of smile that comes from understanding something not with the mind, but with the soul. He wrote beneath the question, because peace can't be taken, it can only be given. Years later, Daniel would go on to lead the Bennett Foundation. Not as a businessman chasing profit, but as a man protecting purpose. He transformed the foundation into a global movement, helping families rebuild trust, guiding leaders toward integrity, and teaching forgiveness as a form of strength, not weakness. Under his guidance, the Bennett legacy entered a new era. And though my name had long since faded from memory, the lesson hadn't. People didn't remember every detail of my story anymore, they didn't need to. What mattered was the truth that survived it. And so, the oak tree stood as a monument, not to revenge, not to redemption, but to the quiet triumph of the human heart. On quiet nights, when the wind swept through the branches, the caretakers swore they could still hear the faintest echo of a man's voice, deep, steady, calm. Greed fades. Love remains. Peace endures. And the world kept turning, wiser for it. Because even as time erased faces, names, and fortunes, one truth outlived them all, that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. And from that redemption, new stories always begin. Generations passed. The world changed, cities rose higher, technology reshaped everything, and the idea of success grew louder, faster, more relentless. But somehow, through it all, the Bennett Foundation remained. The mansion, though older, still stood strong, preserved not as a relic of wealth but as a living archive of humanity's greatest currency, compassion. The oak tree, now massive, had become a landmark. Travelers, business leaders, even world figures came to sit beneath it. They didn't come for photos or prestige. They came for reflection, for the silence that demanded honesty. There was something humbling about that place, where one man's downfall had become the world's reminder of what truly matters. Inside the mansion, walls once lined with oil paintings now displayed letters from those whose lives had changed because of the foundation, stories from around the world. A CEO who had stepped down to save his marriage. A daughter who forgave her estranged father. A brother who let go of resentment and rebuilt a family torn apart. All of them traced back to one simple lesson born decades ago from a storm, a betrayal, and a man's choice to respond with grace instead of destruction. In one of the upstairs rooms, a historian named Elena Brooks worked late into the night, compiling a book on the history of the Bennett legacy. Her research had led her through thousands of archived letters, business records, and diary entries, all written by people who had come through the Foundation's programs. But what fascinated her most wasn't the structure of the institution, it was the spirit that held it together. Late one night, she found something buried deep in an old file cabinet, an unmarked folder. Inside it was a faded letter, written in ink that had begun to blur with age. At the top, the handwriting was steady and elegant. To whoever finds this, if my name still means something, let it be this: a man is not remembered for what he built, but for what he mended. I made mistakes, grave ones. But I learned that forgiveness is not surrender. It's mastery. The kind that money can't buy, and power can't touch. If you ever face betrayal, don't let it turn you cruel. Let it make you wise. Because every empire will crumble, but peace is eternal. Charles Bennett. Elena sat there for a long time, the room silent except for the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. She felt the weight of those words settle deep in her chest. Then she smiled faintly and whispered, "You didn't just build a company, Mr. Bennet. You built a philosophy." Months later, when her book was published, it became a quiet phenomenon. Not a bestseller in the traditional sense, but something deeper, a guide for those who had lost their way. She titled it simply, "Peace Endures, the Bennet Legacy." At the dedication ceremony, held beneath the oak tree, people from all walks of life gathered, business leaders, students, families, and those who had once been broken but were now whole. Elena stood at the podium, holding the aged letter. "This story began," she said, her voice steady, "with betrayal, anger, and loss. But it ended with something far stronger, the understanding that peace isn't found when we win. It's found when we forgive." The crowd was silent. A soft breeze passed through the branches above, scattering rose petals across the grass. She looked up at the sky and smiled, her voice dropping to a whisper meant for one listener only. "Rest well, Mr. Bennet. Your lesson outlived you." And as the crowd stood together under the shadow of that timeless oak, it was as if the mansion itself breathed, a quiet, living monument to everything Charles Bennet had become. He had been a man betrayed by greed, broken by pride, resurrected by grace. And though his body was long gone, his truth still moved through the air like an echo that refused to fade. Because time may silence names. Wealth may vanish. Legacies may shift. But peace, true, earned, enduring peace, lives forever. And somewhere, in the stillness between wind and memory, the voice of Charles Bennet seemed to whisper once more, "The greatest revenge is a life lived without hate. The richest empire is a heart that forgives." And then, silence. Not the kind that ends a story, but the kind that promises it will never truly be over. Years later, the Bennet mansion stood not just as a monument of forgiveness but as a living, breathing soul that seemed to whisper lessons to every visitor who crossed its threshold. Generations had come and gone, yet the air there still felt different, heavy with memory, but light with peace. It was the kind of place that made even the most powerful pause. By then, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires had risen and fallen, economies had crashed and rebuilt, technology had turned humanity into something almost unrecognizable. Yet amid all that noise, the Bennet Foundation had remained steady, a sanctuary untouched by greed or time. A century after Charles Bennet's passing, the oak tree outside had grown so large it seemed to touch the sky. Its roots cracked through old stone, its branches sheltering those who came seeking truth. Locals called it the forgiving tree. It was said that if you sat beneath it long enough, the weight of your anger began to fade, not because of any magic, but because of what the place represented. Every inch of that land had once held pain. Every corner had known betrayal. And yet, what had grown from it was peace. One rainy evening, a young journalist named Maya Reeves arrived at the foundation. She was known for her brutal honesty, exposing corruption, greed, hypocrisy. Her stories had made her famous, and hated. But lately, something inside her had cracked. The power, the attention, it no longer filled her. She'd come to write one final piece. Something different. Something real. She was escorted inside by an old caretaker, a man with silver hair and a calm smile. His name was Thomas, and he'd been with the foundation for over 50 years. "You've come to hear about Mr. Bennet, haven't you?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost reverent. Maya nodded. "I want to understand how one man's choice could change so many lives." Thomas smiled faintly. It wasn't just a choice. It was a surrender. And that's something most people don't understand until they've lost everything. He led her to the study, the same one where Charles Bennet had once written his final letter. The walls were still lined with his books, the faint scent of old paper lingering in the air. On the desk, encased in glass, sat that letter. Maya leaned closer and read it slowly, her fingers brushing the glass like she could somehow feel the ink beneath it. Forgiveness is not weakness. It's the refusal to let hate define the ending. She whispered the words aloud, almost trembling. He really meant it, didn't he? Thomas nodded. He didn't just mean it. He lived it. You see, Miss Reeves, Mr. Bennet could have destroyed everyone who wronged him. Legally, financially, even emotionally. But he chose to heal instead. And in doing so, he built something that outlasted all of them. That night, Maya stayed long after the staff had gone. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled across the sky, but she sat there, in the same chair Charles once used, reading every word he'd ever written. His journals, his letters, his reflections. By dawn, something inside her had changed. The rage that had once fueled her writing had quieted. The hunger for revenge she'd carried for years, against those who'd hurt her, lied to her, used her, began to dissolve into something purer. Weeks later, her article was published. It wasn't an exposé or an accusation. It was a meditation, titled simply, The Forgiveness Empire. It began with a single line: Charles Bennet didn't win his revenge. He transcended it. The piece spread across the world. Millions read it. Some dismissed it as sentimental. Others said it saved their lives. And just like that, the Bennet legacy began again, reborn through a voice that carried his truth into a new century. Maya would go on to become one of the Foundation's greatest advocates, traveling the world, teaching the same lesson that had once saved a broken man and turned a mansion into a symbol: that peace, once chosen, multiplies. That forgiveness doesn't erase justice, it perfects it. That the truest revenge is to live without the poison of hate. And long after even her story ended, the mansion remained. The oak tree still stood, older and wiser, its roots gripping the earth like memory itself. And if you stood beneath it at dusk, when the air grew still and the light turned gold, you could almost hear it, a whisper in the leaves, carried from one soul to the next: let go. Rise higher. Begin again. And so, the Bennet legacy lived on, not as a tale of betrayal or wealth or vengeance, but as proof that forgiveness, once planted, can outlive every storm. Years rolled into centuries. The world outside transformed, towers of steel replaced brick, digital skies replaced stars, and people spoke more through machines than hearts. Yet, through all of it, the Bennet mansion endured. It stood like time itself had bowed to it, its walls weathered but proud, its windows reflecting not just light, but history. The oak tree outside had grown into a giant, ancient and wise, its roots now entwined with the bones of the earth itself. People still came. From every corner of the planet, they arrived, seekers, wanderers, the broken, the powerful, the forgotten. They came not for wealth or glory, but for understanding. The legend of Charles Bennet had long crossed into myth, told in classrooms, whispered in sermons, quoted in speeches. But those who came to the mansion knew, this was no myth. It was a memory carved into wood, stone, and wind. Inside the great hall hung a portrait, restored countless times, of Charles Bennet himself. Clean-shaven, steady eyes, a quiet strength in his gaze. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "He turned vengeance into virtue, and built peace from pain." The foundation had evolved into something greater than anyone could have imagined, now known as the Global Bennet Initiative. It had chapters in over 100 countries, teaching ethical leadership, conflict resolution, and the art of forgiveness. It had rebuilt communities torn by war, helped rival families reconcile, and transformed prisons into schools. Every year, the world paused on the anniversary of Charles Bennet's rebirth, the day he chose peace over revenge. It was known globally as the Day of Forgiveness. On that day, under the oak tree, thousands would gather in silence. Candles lit the mansion's steps, their flames dancing in the twilight. People from every walk of life, rich and poor, guilty and grieving, would stand side by side. And as the final bell tolled from the mansion's tower, a voice would echo through hidden speakers, reciting the last known words of Charles Bennett, preserved from an old recording long ago: "We all die twice, once when our body falls, and once when our name is spoken for the last time. But if your name becomes a reason for someone to forgive, you'll never die at all." That night, as the crowd dispersed, the mansion's lights dimmed one by one until only the glow of the oak tree remained, haloed by thousands of tiny fireflies. The air was still, soft, almost sacred. And in that stillness, the wind stirred. It moved through the branches like a whisper from another time, steady, calm, timeless. I began with anger, but I ended with peace. The tree swayed. The earth breathed. And the mansion, proud and eternal, stood as the final proof that forgiveness is the only inheritance that grows richer when shared. Because revenge ends stories. But forgiveness writes them forever. And so, the story of Charles Bennett, the man betrayed by blood and redeemed by grace, reached its true conclusion, not in a grave, not in a ledger, not even in memory, but in every heart that dared to forgive when hate felt easier. The Bennett legacy lived. And as long as peace endures, it always will.